Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. This is Susie Carr, Director of Membership for the Golden Crown Literary Society. I want to welcome you to the 2020 GCLS Virtual Conference and the Queer Books Are Lit and Millennial Perspective panel. For those of you new to the Golden Crown Literary Society, the GCLS recognizes and rewards quality literary works about women who love women and provides learning opportunities, encouragement, and assistance to new and established writers. We have a highly respected writing academy, an annual gathering of hundreds of readers, writers, publishers, and editors, and a monthly GCLS members-only online book club. We invite you to learn more about the GCLS and perhaps become a member by visiting our website, goldencrown.org. The GCLS would like to thank everyone who continues to support us through donations. If you'd like to make a donation, please visit the website and click on Donate. Here are a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We'll have about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of this session for Q&A. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Please be sure to use Zoom Q&A box to submit a question. This is the section our moderator will be monitoring. If you run into technical issues, please log off and log back in because this usually resolves most issues. Okay, that does it for announcements. We hope that you enjoy the presentation. I'd like to turn over the session to your moderator, Barbara Ann Wright.
Hi, everybody. I'm Barbara Ann Wright. I'm a writer and an editor for Bold Strokes Books, and I'll be moderating what those damn kids have to say about queer books. First of all, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists really quickly, and then we're going to jump into some questions. So give a wave as I introduce you, please. In no particular order, Jane Esther. Jane Esther can be found at her house outside of Boston playing Animal Crossing, watching Golden Girls, and feeding her chickens, hopefully all at the same time. Her latest book is Convergence, the sequel to Uninvited. Ashley Bartlett. Ashley was born and raised in California. Her life consists of reading, writing, and editing. Most of the time, Ashley engages in these pursuits while sitting in front of a coffee shop with her wife. Aw, it's a glamorous life. She is an obnoxious, sarcastic punk ass, but her friends don't hold that against her. She lives in Sacramento. Tegan Shepard. Tegan has always spent quiet moments weaving stories in her head. It didn't occur to her until recently to write them down. Now that she started, she can't seem to stop. She's a history buff, a gamer, and an unrepentant nerd, the best kind. She lives in Virginia with her very patient wife and 2 surly cats. Again, it's the best kind. Her previous publications with Bella Books include Visiting Hours, Bird on a Wire, Across Dark Horizon, and Then There Was Her. Her latest novel, The Queen of Humboldt, will be published in October 2020. Sandy Lowe. Sandy has a master's degree in publishing from the University of Sydney, Australia, and is the senior editor at Bold Strokes Books. Her novels include Party of Three, which is out now, and If You Dare, which is due to be released in December. Sam Liddell. Sam now resides in Sellard, California with her girlfriend and their Jack Russell Terrier. She is currently working on her 3rd novel and has the shortest bio in the history of bios. So let's just go right into questions here and get really personal and all up in our panelists' business. When was the first time you saw queerness positively depicted on screen? And when was the first time you saw yourself, if you did? Now let's pick somebody at random here. Ashley Bartlett.
Okay, so it was 2004, I'm gonna say. And we were at my friend Rachel's house with my brother and his girlfriend, and we're watching the VMAs. For those of you who remember the VMAs that year, Madonna was on. I'm seeing a lot of nodding. You guys remember this. And she kissed Britney Spears, and then she kissed Christina Aguilera, and then Missy Elliott came out in like a tux, and it was dope as fuck. Not exactly queer. It was queer representation, but none of the people involved are queer, so that's kind of a bummer, but I was 17, so I did not care. Yeah, and I don't think that I've ever seen myself depicted on screen. My wife and I were discussing this. The closest thing would probably be either anything Bex Taylor Klaus has done in the last 5 years, and that's generous. Maybe Nico on Vita, but with my gender presentation, I'm just not represented.
Well, that's a shame. Well, we'll have to fix that. Tegan Shepard with the most awesome hair ever. How about you?
Thank you. Just got it done today. So for me, it was Friends, which is a super problematic show. We'll be honest about that. But at the time, actually, Carol and Susan's relationship was probably the best you could expect. And they were the only stable, supportive, loving, happy couple for the entire run of the show. So honestly, it's not a bad rep. As far as when I've seen myself, the only time actually is Corky from Bound. Thank God for the Wachowskis, honestly. There aren't a lot of masculine of center characters out there. And I mean, truly masculine of center, not like male gaze. Oh, she's got a butch, but she has long hair and she wears a dress at parties. Like characters who dress like I dress and have their hair like me. And fortunately, Bound was one of the first Women Loving Women films I ever saw. So it was really nice to see myself early on. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it since, but that's, why I write what I write.
Damn.
Sorry, unmute myself. There we go. I was really kind of trying to think of the first time I remember seeing positive queer representation, and I was kind of struggling with it. The first thing that came to my head, honestly, was watching Xena when I was 12 years old, which is not necessarily, outright queer representation, but it was what I first kind of saw when I was like 12 years old and thought that's not quite straight. And so that, and then probably like Willow on Buffy was the next thing, but otherwise I never exactly saw myself in anything in media. I saw bits and pieces throughout. So kind of like what I think Tegan was saying, that's why I kind of wanted to start writing things that were a little closer to what was familiar to me.
How about you, Sandy?
This was a hard question for me too. I don't feel like my memory goes back that far. Sorry, my cat, hang on. I think Ellen DeGeneres was the first out queer person that I really saw on TV. And I remember being a little concerned because a lot of her comedy routines depicted how problematic her experience was, which is, very true for her and the time. And I was of a different generation. So I was like, oh gosh, is that what it's going to be like for me? Oh no. And it took me a while to kind of realize that that the climate had changed in some ways. She's obviously American and I'm Australian, and there were some differences, but that was the first time I saw a gay woman. In terms of whether I see myself represented, obviously I'm feminine of center, and so I feel like we do have a lot more representation in mainstream media. I really resonated with the romantic comedy Imagine Me and You, which is a really kind of sweet, cute romantic comedy that has a lesbian storyline with two feminine of center women.
Yeah. Jane.
I think I have to say, this is not like positive necessarily. I don't actually know, but I remember there was one time in the original Party of Five where like Nev Campbell like kissed somebody, like another woman, and that was maybe one of the first times that I had ever like seen that on screen. So like I definitely like taped that episode and just like watched that part over and over again. I have literally no context for it otherwise. But I would say also Rosie O'Donnell, I know it's not like a depiction of somebody, but she was like pretty outwardly queer. She never said it, but like you kind of knew. And so like, yeah, just seeing her kind of being successful and, hanging out with all these like really cool people was really cool. I don't know that I've ever necessarily looked for or felt like I needed to see like myself reflected. But I would say like any time that I've seen like queer representation in any kind of media is for me enough.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing here is, even though there's a lot of queer representation, well, not a lot, some queer representation in media now, most of you didn't even have it when you were younger, even though, you know, you're the generation that everyone refers to as the digital generation with access to everything and everything better than everyone else had it. So when was the first time that you said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write stories and they're going to have queer characters in them? And let us go with Jane first.
Okay. I wrote a story in college that I published in like the little like college literary magazine, and that was about me and the person that I was dating at the time. So that was queer. And then sort of as I was like reading a lot of these like classics like Ruby Fruit Jungle, Oranges Aren't the Only Fruit, you know, I never necessarily was like, I need to write that. But I sort of like did end up writing some stories here and there. And then I was like really inspired to like actually write something and like try my hand at finishing it too, when I was reading like a lot of Bold Strokes books.
So it sounds like you need to write a book called The Accidental Lesbian, because you just kind of stumbled into it there. How about you, Sandy?
Gosh, well, I've worked for Bold Strokes books in one capacity or another for, I feel like over 10 years now, which makes me feel old on a panel for Millennials. But I didn't start writing books myself until probably 2 years ago. I obviously work with a lot of authors, and so I feel like I was quite intimidated by the process. Like, oh, what could I possibly have to say for 75,000 words? That seems like so many words. And so it took me quite a long time to just get to a place in my life and my experience and my comfort zone to write books myself.
So you weren't like, this shit is easy, I'm gonna rake in some of this money.
It's not easy, you guys. So not the hardest thing I've ever done.
How about you, Sam?
So what motivated me to start writing, what I wanted to see, I don't know, I guess two things, kind of going back to what Sandy was saying earlier about that sort of fear of, you know, the not necessarily positive representation that we were seeing when we were growing up, and thinking, oh goodness, is that it? If so, yikes. Like, how can I, you know, change that in some way? I think that was kind of like the first thought for me in terms of trying to seek other forms of representation, which eventually took the form of writing for me. I think honestly, I tried writing something in college, which was not outright queer, but it was clearly like screaming to be gay. But I wasn't ready to do that yet for where I was in my life. But then actually, I moved to a different country, and that actually kind of ended up giving me the space to, I guess, kind of the freedom, if you will, mentally, to be able to say, okay, I can do this. And yeah, I started then and haven't stopped.
That's cool. It's amazing. Screaming to be gay sounds like it would make a good anthology. Tegan, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like with everybody else, I kind of came to it by accident. It didn't start till much later because I was writing fanfic, because I think that's a lot of that, you know, we're looking for that positive representation in media. We're not finding it, so we make it ourselves through fanfic. And I just kind of wanted my own characters. So that's kind of when I transitioned from fanfic to lesfic.
Cool. And Ashley?
So I started younger than most people here and in general, because I'm an arrogant bastard. And when I was a kid, I read all the time. That was my life. I didn't like to go outdoors. I mean, with this complexion, it would have been a bad idea. So I stayed inside and I read a lot. And when I was in high school, Amazon was starting to really become a thing. And it was just books then. But my mom always got books for me, no matter what they were. And so I discovered queer fiction when I was in high school. And I would just fill the cart with Radcliffe. I'll be honest, it was just Radcliffe. And she would order it. And so I would get these boxes of books. So it was very easy for me to say, okay, I've got this piece of representation and I can replicate that. So I submitted a short story to an anthology when I was a teenager, and it came out when I was 19. And right after that, I started writing what became Sex and Skateboards, my first book. So the takeaway really here is just that I was dumb and young and didn't know any better, and it worked out really well. I don't know how, because I'm an idiot. So. But that's really what started me with this.
Yeah, stumbling into success is fine. It just proves that you're the overachiever that everybody thought you were. So let's get into some harder questions here for those of you who might be drinking already. Are there differences in the way that you think lesfic treats non-lesbian queer identities in comparison to the mainstream media? And what role do you have? I'm not going to put me in there because I'm a little bit older than everybody else in the room. What role do you have as young authors to make this space? For example, do you include other queer identities in your own work? And so this is a hard question. Who wants the hard question first? Tegan looks shell-shocked. We'll pick her.
Ooh, yeah, I was looking forward to this one. Yeah. So I make it a point to put a variety of queer identities in my work. I think we all should. I think younger authors in general are more likely to show that sort of diversity. There are definitely differences in the way that mainstream media and lesfic show different identities, specifically because it's kind of my hill that I like dying on. Bi and pan characters in mainstream fiction, in mainstream media it's awful. It's very problematic. But I think we need to be honest here. It ain't much better in lesfic. So on TV, you've got bi characters are always promiscuous and cheating, and they're always feminine, and all that's bad. And we also need to look at the fact that we have that a lot in lesfic too. So I was a Goldie judge this year. And in my category, we had one book that had a pretty bad example of bi erasure. There was some really gross ableism in another one. And there was a really egregious example of biphobia in a third book. And honestly, two of those are from one of the major publishers in our genre. We need to do better. That should never get past an editor. A publisher should never want their name attached to that. There's a lot of things that we need to address in lesfic community. I think anybody who follows Katie Williamson on Twitter, she's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, especially the last couple of days. There's a lot of stuff we need to address, but the biphobia in lesfic is something we need to talk about right now.
Well, let's talk about it, Sandy Lowe.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we all have a responsibility, whether we're millennials or not. I think, as Tegan said, it can be less of a hurdle for millennials because of the environment in which we have come of age. But to say that it's, millennials' issue or millennials' responsibility, I think is to narrow it. I think it's everyone's responsibility, including ours. And we all play a part. So I'm not an expert. I'm on this panel and giving my opinion, but I absolutely have no expertise in this field and don't want to claim to. But I am open and willing to learn, and I think that we are entering, hopefully, a new era in which people are more open and more willing, and we don't have this sense of white fragility or lesbian fragility or any kind of unwillingness to really look at ourselves and our own Black spots. So I welcome and appreciate all that feedback. Keep it up.
All right. Jane.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Tegan and Sandy said. I will say that I have been accused of biphobia in one of my books. However, so it's sort of like a character who is biphobic. And then in the next book, she gets called out on that, and she's sort of like, it's coming from like a place of really just like regret from her in terms of the person, not necessarily like actual biphobia. But yes, I'm with you. I think that if like our characters can have those journeys of being like, I'm shitty, and then, okay, I'll stop being shitty, that's also like really good. I really like to include people of color and trans characters in my books, the latest books at least, for trans characters. And I will say that like the media is still so shitty, and I'm going to give you one specific example, and this might be spoiler alert, but I feel like both of these things have been out now for enough time that it shouldn't matter. So I'm going to talk about Tell It to the Bees. Has anybody seen this? Yeah. So, okay, so Tell It to the Bees movie had like this shitty ass ending where like they split up, and I was like, are you serious? I cannot believe this. So I saw it in the theaters. And then I was like, but I really want to read the book. So I ordered the book, which was hard to get because it's not in print in the US. And guess what? The book has a happy ending. Like, why could you literally not just give the characters on screen the same, it's no extra work for you. So the fact that the director of that movie or whoever wrote the script felt that they needed to like specifically take this happy ending and just like walk all over it. It's just, I'm livid about this still, as you can see. So yeah, so it's almost not even enough that we are writing these stories like they're transferred to any other sort of medium. Like there still has to be other people who are also on our side here. So rant over.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed the rant, and it's the hero's journey put the most succinctly I have ever heard it was, I'm shitty, I want to be less shitty. Sam, adding to that.
I was going to say rants are important sometimes. And I mean, I agree with everything everyone said so far. I think going back to like mainstream media versus, like lesfic, and I think we might just be slightly more attuned to the need for more representation. And we still have that responsibility to get it right, to reach out to, readers, to make sure that we are, sensitivity readers or whoever it may be, that we are holding ourselves accountable to make sure the representation is the way it should be. And I kind of started thinking about the stories I'm telling too. And I mean, I'm still learning as a writer. And, in like my fantasy world, nobody's necessarily labeled, which in one sense is sort of freeing, but I also, I understand that, sometimes seeing or reading that label is important for somebody to be like, oh, okay, that's me. And so, sort of navigating that duality is something that I'm always thinking about and trying to be better about and understand more as a writer.
Nice. Bring it home, Ashley.
All right, so I think that as millennials, we just are surrounded by a different type of queerness than our predecessors, and because of that, I think it's a lot easier for us to see these things. But Sandy's right, it's everyone's job. It's just, I think that we are able to open it up for people in ways that they weren't even aware of. Full disclosure, I am also Jane's editor. Hi, Jane. So the book that she was talking about, I think did some really interesting things. Oh, it's 2 books, but where she was interrogating the privilege that we have. And I think that that is the most important thing we can do from a position of power. And we are all white lesbians for the most part. And so in this community, we have power. And we need to not include people of color or trans people or bi people for the sake of including them. I think we need to include them because they're part of the world, but also because we can interrogate our own power structures through our fiction. So white authors should not just include Black characters because they want to sell to Black audiences. You're not going to do it accurately. What you can do is interrogate your own whiteness, and that is going to appeal to a broader audience. So I think that if we are interrogating our own biphobia, then it's okay to include it, as long as you're condemning it to some extent. I mean, you can't just put in biphobic characters for fun. But if you want to villainize someone, that's a great way to do it. If you have them in your first chapter being, you know, a certain type of person. Like right now we have these dog whistles. If you want to make a character bad, make them a cop. And maybe that's not fair beyond this moment in time, but it's going forward going to become more and more the way that we view these things. And we have the luxury of essentially being on the forefront of a lot of these things because we're already outside of the norms. We already don't exist in society. So if we want to dig deep and look at the unpleasantness in our world, we're well positioned to do so. And as an editor, and Barbara is in the same place I am here, we very much have a responsibility to find these things. And I'll call it Jane again because it's fun. So she had a character who's trans and dead named them. And I was like, do we need to? And she was like, we do not. And it was a discussion that we had though, like, was there a reason to dead name the character? And then we determined that there wasn't, but there very well conceivably could have been. And that's why you have to have these conversations with your authors, with your editor, because the only way to fix these problems is to discuss them.
I agree. So we've kind of talked about the past a little bit. Oh, Tegan, did
Sorry,
you?
can I just like put one thing in there? And I think that one thing Ashley is absolutely right on all of those points. I think that one thing we do have to be careful about is in villainizing a character, we need to make sure that we are not adding trauma onto members of our own community. So like you said, there is a way to have a character who is clearly described as a villain who, you know, nobody is going to say, oh, no, maybe they're right about being biphobic, you know, that kind of thing. You know, there's ways to do that. I think that we just have to, like you said, we have to be very careful in the way that we approach that as just like we'll toss out, you know, I need a villain, I'll just have them say something shitty about bi people. You know, that maybe not the best way to go, but you know, like you said, you need to be a little more thoughtful about it.
Okay, so we've talked about like things we saw in the past, how we got started. We've kind of talked about some other identities, and so I think that'll come into this next question too. What do you think the hallmarks are of millennial queer fiction, assuming that you read as much as you write, which, you know, fake it if you don't. Do you think the work of millennial authors has an effect on culture or media overall? Sandy.
When I read this question from you, I immediately thought of Sally Rooney's Normal People, which was touted as like the novel of the millennial generation. And the author actually came out against that statement and said, no, this, I mean, I wrote this novel, you know, from my own personal, you know, mind and experience, and I'm not writing for, you know, for a generation, and I don't assume that it's going to apply to anyone else. And I thought it was very interesting, the debate over what is the millennial experience, because I do feel like with any generation, it's incredibly broad, and that it is problematic to kind of state specific things as applicable to, you know, so many millions of people. From my own reading experience, I feel like one of the hallmarks is a kind of a wit that is rather dry and deprecating, deprecating of the world, I think, more so than self-deprecating. I feel like there are themes of survival in the fiction more so than novels of other generations, other authors. That hero-ship has changed, that it's not necessarily the first responder type heroes or the dramatic heroes, but the everyday heroes, kind of those successes of everyday life, and getting by is an act of heroism in and of itself.
And I think too, the millennial experience, drowning in student debt and maybe never having the opportunity to own your own home, probably goes in there too. Yes. Dan.
Sandy actually said a lot of what I was going to say too. And yeah, just that things are definitely shifting. I think we're kind of in the process, like in progress of leaving our cultural mark, if you will, as the question says, as millennials. Yeah, there's definitely, I think, at least from the millennial literature I'm reading, a certain particular style. Dry was a word that I was also going to use to describe it, that dry sort of subtle humor. And yeah, just, I mean, our world has shifted, and I feel, I mean, maybe every generation thinks this, but I feel like our world has shifted very intensely and dramatically in our lifespan. And, you know, just taking all of that and putting it through our perspective of, yeah, just, you know, living our lives and, like you said, surviving has kind of taken on a different meaning. So I think those are some things that you see a lot in millennial literature.
Ashley.
So I really like what Sandy said about survival. And I think that if you look at our generation and the trauma that we have endured, you can compare it to the First World War and that generation that was just decimated. And what we got from that essentially was irony. The concept of irony was essentially invented as a result of the First World War, because if your world is traumatic, then you have no other way to exist in it unless you can see it for that ironic detachment that, like, we have to use that to get through the world. So I think that our generation was born into a world where queerness was visible but vilified. So in '86, we had Bowers versus Hardwick in the US. Sorry, Sandy, I don't know Australian sexuality laws the same way. But we were born into a world where the Supreme Court said no, gay sex is illegal. And then it wasn't until 2003, when I was in my senior year of high school, I'm guessing most of you are about the same age, that gay sex, except for Barbara, sorry, that gay sex was no longer illegal in the United States. And so the millennial generation is in general traumatized by 9/11, by student debt, by being raised by boomers that think the world is going to be something other than what it is for us. But queers have that trauma compounded in a lot of ways, because you can exist, but only if you fill this specific role that we have given you. You have to be a certain kind of queer. And I think that millennial queer fiction specifically has really interrogated that idea. And because of that, you get the dry wit, you get the sarcasm, but you also get a lot of people who just don't give a fuck. And when all bets are off, then it makes it a lot easier to dive into these issues with humor and a certain amount of irreverence.
I think I heard it. I read it in a comic strip one time. I don't remember which one. That if success is impossible, then you're free. Jane, what do you think?
So I'm going to say something, I don't know if it's like really true, but I feel like a lot of the queer fiction that's written now, whereas sort of our the predecessors that, or older folks who have grown up in a world where it was really hard to be queer, and just like sort of scary. Like a lot of those are still like coming out stories. Whereas I feel like a lot of millennial queer stories are like, okay, we're like past that now. We're gonna just kind of be queer and it's not a big deal. And yeah, a lot of that is like what Ashley said, like just, you know, fuck everything, who cares? So yeah, so I think that there's sort of that shift, and definitely more themes of, yeah, like climate change. I'm probably just talking about myself, but sort of kind of looking at the future as something that we're sort of unsure about.
Tegan.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jane. One of the things I like about millennial queer fiction is that we've kind of moved past, we've moved past coming out stories and worlds with societal homophobia. There's always going to be a place for coming out stories in queer fiction. I mean, it's part of our journey. But we're at that point where we're exploring those lives beyond. I mean, even not just in lesfic, but if you talk about like the wider across mediums, like some of the shows like She-Ra, Legends of Tomorrow, Winona Earp, all of these shows, they're not making a big deal about their characters coming out anymore. They just come out, or they just are gay. I'm desperately in love with She-Ra right now. So that's one of the things. And Noelle Stevenson, the creator, is definitely of the millennial generation. And there wasn't even a discussion, like nobody cared. And there's so many queer characters in that. And it's just there. And that's really exciting because it gives us so much more room to breathe. It gives us so much more to talk about when the story is not centered around hate.
I've been reading, I love She-Ra as well, and I've been reading a lot about it. And I actually read that there was some pushback, that they couldn't just say from the very beginning, look, Catra and She-Ra are in love, okay? That they had to like sneak in queer characters until the end, and they were like, well, we've got to have them kiss. I mean, it's the end. So even then, they had to be sneaky, and I was like, oh, God damn it. I couldn't have just been no big deal from the beginning. Sorry. So I think it's that kind of same, I'm fed up with this, that had me, that I started writing queer characters. And everyone thinks that you meddling kids introduce change more than anything. I think that's probably what the millennial generation is going to be known for, is not only introducing change, but demanding change. So I want to know, what is it about your own life and in your own writing career that made you think, no, forget it. I'm going to say what I want to say. I'm going to introduce change this way through my writing. So I'm going to get really personal now and up in your business. And I'm going to get up in Jane's business first.
Ooh, Barbara, I did not invite you up in my business.
Yes, you did. By agreeing to be on this panel.
Consent is sexy, guys. Don't forget.
You can come anytime, Barbara. Yes, I've never ever been afraid of like just blowing stuff up and saying things to people that make some kind of change, like being that squeaky wheel, as we refer to people in my organization who are like just kind of jerks. And so I kind of in my writing, like, I'm just like, you know what, like, I don't care. Like, I want to see a world where this and this are like just commonplace. And I'm going to include trans characters, and I don't care what people think. And I hope that it probably turns like very few people off to see a trans character, I would say, in a lesfic book, I would hope. But I think it definitely speaks to some sort of younger queer folks who may be like sort of navigating that, or, it's not a big deal for them. So I think that makes it more accessible. to those folks. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's what you get.
It was entertaining, and you know, I really can't complain because I've been up all in your business. So I got to take what I can get there. Ashley.
So I was a queer kid even before I knew what that meant. I, again, didn't go outside very much. I like to sit inside and read, and I was precocious, and I was tiny. For those of you who haven't met me in real life, I'm like 5'3".
Like this tall.
I am. And I take up a lot of space because of that. Some would say I'm compensating, but because of that, even as a child, was always the smallest in my class, and I was the smartest in my class. And so I liked to challenge things because I had to. One of my mother's favorite stories of me is one of her colleagues went to my elementary school for something. And there was a kid out on the playground who turned around and said, "Well, I am appalled." And he's like, "Hey, I think I found your kid." And it was, because what sort of second grader says things like, "Well, I'm appalled"? A queer one. And I think when you already are queer and then you grow up and you have something to direct that queerness at, which is what I think that we have done with fiction and with media and how we approach the world, we're queering it for ourselves, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I incorporate all of that. My characters aren't just queer in that they are lesbians. They're queer in that I write a drug dealer who is supposed to be heroic. And you're fucking with the rules of society when you do that sort of thing. And I think we just have to give ourselves permission to do that sort.
Tegan.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a lot of it is that I've already seen the world change a lot. And so I know it can change more. Like I'm a little bit older than Ashley. So I was in high school when my local CBS station refused to air Ellen's Puppy episode. And since then, I've seen Don't Ask, Don't Tell fall. I've seen same-sex marriage legalized. I've seen the White House lit up with the rainbow flag. 20 states have banned conversion therapy. I mean, and then just last week, the Supreme Court banned workplace discrimination. There's been so much change. We've come such a long way, and I think that we can continue that journey. And part of that is normalizing queer people getting happy endings. And that's what I want to do.
What about you, Sandy?
Well, I write mostly erotica and erotic romance, and I think it's quite interesting being a millennial, writing in that genre, and the kind of different experiences and just different mindset that you bring to it. So the novel that I just finished writing, If You Dare, deals heavily with consent. And what does it mean to consent? And is consent a single yes? Is the legal definition, the one that would or would not hold up in court, is that true consent? And so I think it's interesting and it's fun to delve into these burgeoning issues in our society, which I do through things like consent because of what I write. But I think as a millennial, when you take an issue that's current and timely and put it into your fiction from the perspective of someone who is younger, who is kind of experiencing it in its current context, experiencing it as a coming of age issue, hopefully it gives it a very relevant, fresh take on it that hopefully will apply generally.
What about you, Sam?
So kind of going back to that whole idea of change that Tegan was saying, and just how much of it I feel like we have experienced. And I don't know, I for one always kind of feel like the world around me is in a sense of hyperdrive. And I think the internet has had a lot to do with that. And There's just so much to read and see and listen to, and it can be overwhelming at times. So for me in my writing, it's about sort of reaching into that chaos and that sense of constant change and seeing what I can grab onto and sort of shape and contribute to in some positive, hopefully, way. And so that's where I generally start from with my work, is trying to just make sense of the world around me, and with media and writing and seeing everything that's been done, like the tropes and things like that, and seeing how I can maybe tweak them or make them, I don't know, just change them in whatever way I can.
Okay, cool. I'm going to dip into the audience questions here for a bit because they're stacking up on us and I want to get to as many as possible. So here's our first one. You all are the future of our literature. What is one issue you feel will be essential to be addressed by your generation? What do you see as your generation's crowning contribution to our literature? We've gone over that a little bit, but we can delve more into it and combine it with something personal, like what is it that you personally want to leave behind? And let us start with Sandy Lowe.
I'm so glad you said personally, because I was going to have trouble globalizing this. I think for me, what I seek to do in my writing is take shame out of sex. That's kind of my the hill that I'm going to die on as a writer, is to remove that sense of shame, especially as queer people, especially as women, to depict sex and relationships in a way that really, hopefully in a new light, that just takes shame and guilt out of the equation.
Do you think that millennials get tired of talking about millennials as a whole?
I don't know. I think we're all quite, we see the media, talk about us more than we see them talk about other generations, because we, I think, are more kind of aware of ourselves. So if we see a headline with millennials, then we're more likely to gravitate towards it than, say, boomers. So I don't know if it's a perception issue or if it really is that kind of the world is talking about millennials more so than other generations. I think it's also an economic thing. We are the up and coming workforce. We're the ones having kids right now, so I think that's where a lot of the attention is coming from. It doesn't bother me personally, but I could see how it could be daunting for others.
What about you, Sam? What's your legacy, and do you get tired of being lumped in with every single person in the same age range?
I personally don't get tired of it. I don't know. I'm okay with it. I am a millennial, so.
Well, yeah, you're a millennial. You're probably going to be okay with it, whatever.
People are going to say what they're going to say. Sorry, the first question was my legacy personally.
Yes.
That seems very daunting to me, but I don't know. I just want to write stories about queer ladies having adventures that have positive endings, and I want them to be stories that people eventually want to return to one day. That's what I hope for.
Yeah, like Ashley disclosed earlier, I am Sam's editor, and she writes stories about queer ladies having adventures, and they're very good, and you should buy them. Ashley.
Okay, so I think that our generation is kind of responsible for expanding the acronym, and I think to some extent we have to continue educating about that. So it's not just LGBTQ, it's LGBTQIAAOP2S. And it took me like 4 years of college to get that all down. And it's kind of a good litmus test for people to see how much of it they understand. because we have the power to educate people about our community, and we are more than just that spectrum. And I think that we can also expand it out the other direction and look at gender presentation. Obviously, I am masculine of center, and I think that a lot of the fiction we've seen, if there is anyone who's masked, then they're butch, and I am very much not butch. That sounds like far too much responsibility for me, and I'm quite comfortable being just an annoying little brother, and that in and of itself is a gender identity. And so I think that my fiction looks at those pieces of gender in a different way. So my last book or two, there's a teenager who has friends who are on the spectrum of gender in different ways. And I think that Zoomers very much do not prescribe to our binary. So we have some responsibility to pave the way for them so that they can be who they want to be, who they are, just as much as Gen X paved the way for us to say, hey, we're more than just lesbians.
That's a good point. What do you think, Tegan?
Well, as far as talking about being a millennial, I'm right on the cusp of Gen X and millennial, so I go with my Gen X apathy. I don't care. We'll talk about whatever. Yeah, but I do think it's important to talk about the progression of the way things are going. I mean, you know, somebody mentioned earlier that millennials are now the ones having kids. You know, we're the ones that are responsible for this great generation that uses TikTok to screw over Trump. I mean, this is a great thing to have in life. As far as what my legacy, that I gave queer women a happy ending. That's all I want people to remember me for.
And not in the whole like massage parlor sense.
Exactly. Oh, I should have thought about my wording there. That's why we need editors.
It's true. All right, Jane.
I think that was perfect wording, Tegan. So yeah, I don't mind being, you know, a millennial or whatever. It is really interesting because I have a sister who's 5 years younger, and I'm on the higher end of millennial, I think. Yes. And she's also a millennial, but like the way that we view the world is kind of totally different. Like I'm an Elizabeth Warren millennial, and she's like a Bernie Sanders millennial. Like she's the girls' generation, you know, the Lena Dunham type. So I think it's useful to kind of to sort of have that wording, but also like there's such a difference in different ends of it. In terms of my legacy, I want people to read my books and like have a story where like if they were like, oh, I don't know about climate change, you know, maybe it's not real, like maybe through reading a story where like climate change is very much like already happened and is like in the process of happening, and we're like having to leave the earth because of it, you know, maybe that like kind of gives them that extra sense of like, oh, maybe I should pay attention to that. And the same with my latest two, which is sort of, I was sort of trying to figure out like what is like a utopia that, how can we get to a utopia? How can we get to like the place that we all want to be, that we're sort of fighting for now? And so maybe like a sense of hope.
That's nice. I like that. So a lot of these questions here that I'm seeing have to deal with age, which again, that's what the panel's about. So you meddling kids can't be angry about that one. So I'm seeing people asking if you're interested in reading stories about lesbians who are in their 40s or 50s. And then also, what do you think about the very popularity of age gap themes in lesbian literature right now? So I'll give you a second to think about that one. Are you ready? Who looks ready? Ashley looks ready.
Okay, so I'll work in reverse. Age gap, I think that it goes back to what Sandy was saying. I'm all for an age gap romance, but you have to pay attention to consent. So if we're talking about a 21-year-old, they really just have no business dating someone who is old enough to be their parent. I don't think that someone can consent when there is that amount of an age difference. And I say that as someone whose parents are 20 years apart. My stepmother was 24 when she met my dad. That's just creepy, guys. What are you doing? So if we can pay attention to the optics of that when we pull out, then I'm all for it. As far as reading older protagonists, I have done that. I grew up on that because when I was a teenager, the only queer fiction we had involved older protagonists, or what I viewed at the time as older protagonists. I'm sure they were like 30, and now I am over that. But I think that there's something to be said for reading someone who's your age when you are that age. We all read the fiction that came before us. I have a Bebo Brinker tattoo, for those who you can't see it. We all read the classics, and to us, Ruby Fruit Jungle is a classic. It is a piece of historical fiction. It's something that we read in college. And so to me, that's studying. It's not pleasure. And maybe I'm going to get reamed for admitting that.
I don't know, Tegan, are you going to get a reamer for admitting that?
I mean, I read Ruby Fruit Jungle in high school, so no, I mean, I think that's totally true. I mean, you can't really know where you're going or where you want to go unless you know where you've been. That's super important. As far as the age gap thing and the older protagonist, my youngest protagonist that I've written in my 5 books is 28, which I don't think is super young. But and the age gap, that was actually an age gap romance. The other character was 40. I mean, I don't know. I have a love-hate with age gap, and that's from a lot of personal experience. So I definitely don't like if any younger than like late 20s, no, you should not be in an age gap romance. But yeah, I mean, I all of my protagonists are older, and that's what I like to see. I like to see the second relationship in life for people, or like the second significant relationship, or just folks who've been single until their 30s. Like that's what I want to see. I think that's great.
What about you, Sam?
I echo their sentiments. I'm all for reading older protagonists, and just like they were saying, it's what I grew up with. And in terms of age gap relationships, I think I'm not against them, but I also agree that I think it should be done right and should be, I am of the same mindset that I don't think a person in their early 20s should be with somebody, 15, 20 years older, just because now that I'm not that age anymore, I feel like you can't think clearly really at that age, or you're just not mature enough. So, but that's my opinion on that matter.
What do you think, Jane? You're nodding.
Yes, you're not mature enough. As somebody who was in a relationship with a 25-year-old when I was 17, I thought it was like really awesome at the time, but now I'm just like, what were either of us thinking? Also, as a 30s, I'm 36, and I was like, I would literally never date anybody younger than probably 30 at this point. Not anybody at all. I'm married, but what was the other question?
I don't know.
All right.
Reading older protagonists.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it's not like easy necessarily to tell sometimes when you kind of dive into a lesfic book, unless their ages are like made very explicit, or like they're like, oh, we're in college or whatever. But if it's a good story, like I don't care, I'll read it.
All right, bring us home, Sandy.
I'm going to echo something Ashley said, so I may get reamed out too. But I remember when I first started working for Bold Strokes Books, Rad had me read a lot of the classics. And they got a lot of attention in terms of like the history of lesbian fiction and, you know, different presentations that people were doing at the time. And I remember being frustrated. And I remember saying, you know, just because something was the first doesn't mean it's the best. Like, I couldn't understand why these books that didn't reflect my experience were being lauded as, you know, the best examples of the genre. And I think part of that was me not understanding quite how important they were in terms of being the first and how meaningful that is. But I do think there is a difference between a book that is the first of its type, you know, and a book that is the best of its type, which is obviously highly subjective.
Well, with that, I'm afraid our time is up. I'd like to thank all of my lovely panelists and all of our attendees, and I'm going to hand it back now to Susie Carr.
Hey, this was a fantastic panel. Thank you so much, Barbara, for your moderating. It was wonderful. All the panelists, you did a great job. For everybody who attended, thank you for attending as well. There are more great sessions ahead. One is happening right now at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard. It's called Size Matters. So go ahead over there. One last thing I want to say is be sure to check out the author readings on our website. They're coming in and they're just fantastic. I want to wish you all a great day. Thank you so much.